Chapter 9 Review. Let's just take different problems and just go through them from all the sections and see if we can solve them. Solve y squared equals 24. So we can use the square root method. It says when you have something square equals a number, then that something, which is in this case y, will be plus or minus the square root of 24. Now simplify that. That's plus or minus 24. I can break it down to what? Could it be 6 times 4? So it's the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. So that's equal to plus or minus, what is the square root of 4? That's a 2 times the square root of 6. So we have two answers. One of them is negative 2 the square root of 6, and the other one, comma, 2 the square root of 6. Another one. I can do one of two things here. I can either divide both sides by 4, or I can rewrite this one. Dividing by 4 is probably the quickest way. So if you divide by 4, that becomes x squared equals 3. And now we can use the square root method. X equals plus or minus the square root of 3. Since I can't simplify the square root of 3, so one solution is negative the square root of 3, the other one positive the square root of 3. Number 3, solve x squared plus 5 equals to 0. So now I can move the plus 5 to that side. X squared equals negative 5. Something squared equals a number. That means x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 5. But wait a minute. You can't take the square root of a negative number. So this one has no real solution. None of us can take the square root of a negative number. Solve 2a minus 5 squared equals 18. Again, something square equals a number, the square root method. 2a minus 5 without the square should equal to plus or minus the square root of 18. And can we simplify that? 2a minus 5 equals plus or minus 18 is 9 times 2. 2a minus 5 equals plus or minus, what is the square root of 9? 3 times the square root of 2. Now remember, you are solving for a, which means I need to move that negative 5 to this side. And when you change side, you change sign. 2a equals, this becomes plus 5 plus or minus 3 the square root of 2. And finally you want to solve for a, not 2a. So you got to divide this by 2. When you divide this side by 2, you have to divide that side by 2. So a equals to 5 plus or minus 3 the square root of 2 divided by 2. So you have two solutions. One of them is 5 minus 3 the square root of 2 over 2, comma. The second one, 5 plus 3 the square root of 2 over 2. So these are the two answers that we're looking for. So I solved 4 problems using the square root method. Let's look at completing the square. I think it's 5, question 5 now. Solve by completing the square. And we have n squared minus 6n minus 27 is equal to 0. The first time I take that negative 27 and move it to that side, and again, change side, change sign. N squared minus 6n, leave a space. This becomes plus 27. Notice it changes to plus because I'm using change side, change sign. So now to complete the square, we're going to take the coefficient of n, which is this number. We're going to take it, divide it by 2, and square it. And what you want to do with it is add the 9, I'm sorry, not the 3, add the 9 now to both sides. And let's factor this. If you factor that, this becomes n. And again, if you're not good with factoring, I told you before, take that number, and that'll be this n minus 3 times n minus 3. Whatever that number is. Equals, what's 27 plus 9? 36. So this is n minus 3 squared equals 36. Now I can use the square root method. N minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 36. N minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 36, which is 6. And again, change side, change sign. Take the negative 3 there and make it positive 3. So one solution is going to be what? 3 minus 6. The other one, 3 plus 6. What's 3 minus 6? Negative 3. What's 3 plus 6? 9. So we have two answers. N, not x, almost wrote x. N equals negative 3, that's one answer, and 9 is the other answer. Now this problem wasn't bad because the number was nice. What happens if that number is not divisible by 2? Nothing really changes, just dealing with a fraction. So let's take a look at the next example. And I'm going to use completing the square because I want to practice with it. So here we go, x squared plus 3x. And I'm going to take this number that you see, the plus 3, divided by 2 and square it. That's how we complete the square. Can I simplify that? No, I can't. What is 3 squared? 9. What's 2 squared? 4. So I'm going to add 9 over 4 to both sides. And the reason I add it to both sides is whatever you add to one side, you got to add the same thing to the other side. Again, let's factor this. This is x. Notice this number is what? Plus 3 over 2. So if you factor the top, that's what you're going to have. If you factor this, you end up with this. Now, if you want to add these two, this is over 1. You got to find the common denominator, which is what? 4. The 9 over 4 doesn't change, but this one, you got to multiply this by 4 to make it 4. So multiply the top by 4. 4 times 4, that's 16 over 4. This becomes x plus 3 over 2 squared equals 16 plus 9 is 25 over 4. Now we can use the square root method. The square root of 25 is 5. The square root of 4 is 2. And finally, you got to solve for x. So take the plus 3 over 2. There becomes a minus. And since the bottom is the same, you can really make it one fraction. That's a minus 3 plus or minus 5 over 2. So you have two solutions. One of them, minus 3 minus 5 over 2. The other one, minus 3 plus 5 over 2. That's a negative 8 divided by 2. That's a negative 4. This is plus 2 divided by 2. That's a 1. So the two answers are negative 4, comma 1. So even with the fraction, the process didn't really change. You're just dealing with ugly numbers. The one place you have to be nervous about completing the square when this number in the front is not a 1. So let me try an example there. Solve for y. Two y squared plus 8y equals 4. Yeah, go with 4. It's all right. Leave it. Notice this number is not a 1. So to make it a 1, we're going to divide every one of them by 2. Every term. So this becomes y squared plus 4y, leave a space, 4 divided by 2, which is 2. Now again, to complete the square, take this number, divide it by 2 and square it. What's plus 4 divided by 2? Isn't that a plus 2? Square it, which is 4. So I'm going to come back and add 4 to each one of these sides. Factor this, that's y. Notice that's the plus 2. Equals, what's 2 plus 4? 6. Y plus 2 squared equals 6. Now the square root method says y plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 6. And I can't simplify the square root of 6. That's it. I can take the plus 2 to this side, make it a negative 2. So I have two solutions again. Y equals negative 2 minus the square root of 6. The other one, negative 2 plus the square root of 6. So this is solved by completing the square. Again, in some cases, this is really like when you have fractions, it's not a pretty method either. So this has limitation. The square root method only works when you have something squared equals a number. So as I said in the previous video, there's one method that will work regardless what kind of equation you have, and that's using the quadratic formula. This one can solve any quadratic equation. So let's take care of 8. Solve for y. Y squared minus 2y minus 1 is equal to 0. Step number 1, move everything to one side. It is done. Step number 2, factor completely. Identify A, B, and C. So A is 1, B is negative 2, C equals negative 1. And now step number 3, once you identify these pieces, use the quadratic formula to solve them. And that is minus B plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac, hopefully memorize it by now, all of it divided by 2a. I've seen some people put the fraction under the square root only. No, all of it divided by 2a. So this is minus, there's the negative 2, plus or minus, negative 2 squared, minus 4 times a is 1, and c is minus 1. All divided by 2a. It's 2 plus or minus. What's negative 2 when you square it? That's a 4. This is a plus, minus times a minus, that's a plus 4. Two plus or minus the square root of 8 over 2. Now, can I simplify that? 8 can be written as 4 times 2. What is the square root of 4? That's a 2 times the square root of 2 over 2. And notice if you want to simplify this, it has to be multiplication. This is not multiplication. There's addition between them. So the only thing I can do here out of the top is factor out a 2. If you take a 2 out, what's left? 1 plus or minus the square root of 2 divided by 2. And notice this 2 cancels that 2. What's left? 1 plus or minus the square root of 2. So you have two solutions. Y equals 1 minus the square root of 2. The other one, 1 plus the square root of 2. I'll do a couple more with this method, solve using the quadratic formula there. Negative x squared equals 8x plus 1. Again, step number 1, move to one side. And me personally, I like x squared to be positive. So I'll move this one here. And I will have 0 equals x squared plus 8x plus 1. It's positive because when you change side, you change sign. And again, as I said before, I like the equal sign to be on the left. That's the same as the one above it. That's step number 1, move to one side. Identify A, B, and C using the quadratic formula. A equals 1, B equals 8, C equals 2, 1. And again, we're going to use negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. Every time I do this problem, I write that equation, that formula there, because I want it to sink into my head. That's a negative 8 plus or minus 8 squared minus 4 times a. A is 1, c is 1. All divided by 2 times a, which is 2 times 1. Eight squared is what? 64 minus the 4 divided by the 2. The square root of 60 over 2. 60, I can write that 4 times 15. And I chose 4 times 15 because I know the square root of 4. If I went 3 times 20, I have no idea what the square root of 3 is or the 20. That's 2 the square root of 15 over 2. And again, notice on the top you can factor a 2 out. If you factor a 2, 2 times what is negative 8? That's a negative 4. Plus or minus, I took the 2 out, so I have the square root of 15 left there over the 2. And this 2 cancels that 2. And my answer is negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 15. So I have two solutions again. Negative 4 minus the square root of 15. The other one, negative 4 plus the square root of 15. Let's put a different twist on the next one. I'm still going to use the quadratic formula probably. Solve for x. And I have x plus 3 times x minus 2 equals negative 10. Well, that doesn't look nice. So my first thing is I gotta simplify this. I gotta multiply this using the FOIL method. So x times x, that's x squared. X times a minus 2 is negative 2x. 3 times x plus 3x. 3 times a negative 2, that's negative 6, equals negative 10. Collect like terms. Negative 2x plus 3x, that's plus 1x. When I bring that negative 10 to this side, it becomes a plus 10. What is negative 6 plus 10? That's plus 4. Now we have everything on one side. We can identify A, B, and C. A is 1, B is 1, C is 4. X is going to be minus B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC, all of it divided by 2 times A. One squared minus 4 times A is 1, and C is 4. Divided by 2 times 1. One squared is 1, minus 4 times 4 is 16. Now we got a problem. Notice you've been asked to take the square root of a negative number, and none of us can do that. This has no real solution. What does that mean? I can't find one number out there, any number, that if you plugged in, this side will equal to negative 10. None of them. No real solution. Later in math, we have something called complex numbers. There is an imaginary solution, but no real solution to this problem. Can't be done. Let me put another twist on these problems. Solve for x. Two over x plus 1 over x plus 3 is equal to 1. And I'm sure you're wondering, why is this problem here? It doesn't even look like quadratic equation. This entire chapter about a quadratic equation. Well, let's see why. I'm not a fan of fractions, so I want to try to cancel the fractions. And one way to cancel the fractions, you multiply by the LCD. And the LCD is the multiplication of all the different denominators. I see x as a denominator, I see x plus 3 is another one. So I'm going to multiply each one of these by x times x plus 3. So let me multiply this one, x times x plus 3. That's really over 1 if you want to multiply it. This is x times x plus 3 over 1. And x times x plus 3. I'm going to multiply every one of them by that. Now the nice thing about this, notice this x will cancel that x, and you end up with what? 2 times x plus 3. That's what's left. This x plus 3 cancels x plus 3. You end up with x times 1, which is 1x. And let's multiply that. Well, I'll wait. X times x plus 3. Now multiply that. 2x plus 6 plus x equals x squared plus 3x. 2x and x is what? 3x plus 6 equals x squared plus 3x. I want to put all the x's on one side, so let me subtract 3x from both sides. Gone. Gone. We have x squared equals 6. And what do you know? I can use the square root method. I'm not even going to use a quadratic formula. Square root method, something square equals a number. X equals plus or minus the square root of 6. Can you simplify that? No, we can't. So we have two solutions. X equals negative the square root of 6, comma, x equals positive the square root of 6. Let's try graphing here. Let's see. Graph y equals negative x squared minus 2x. Notice the x squared, the coefficient is negative, so I know it's going to be opening downward, concave downward. I'm going to find the axis of symmetry. That's at x equals negative b over 2a. B here is negative 2. And A here is negative 1. That's A here, and there's B. So that's what? Minus, that becomes a plus 2 over a minus 2, which is a negative 1. And if you remember, the only reason we did that, so I don't have to pick 10,000 points to graph them, I'm just going to pick 4 or 5 points and see what one side looks like, then flip it over and I have the other side. So here we go, x here, this is y equals negative x squared minus 2x, and this is x comma y. We're going to write them as a point. So let's see, let's pick values. Now I'm going to start with the negative 1. Here's the minus, negative 1 squared minus 2 times the negative 1. Negative 1 squared is 1 with the minus, that's a negative 1, plus 2, that's 1. So the value negative 1 comma 1. I'm going to pick points on one side only, so I'll go to the right of that. How about the 0? Negative 0 squared minus 2 times 0. 0 minus 0, that's a 0. I'll try the 1. 1 squared minus 2 times 1. That's a negative 1 minus the 2, which is negative 3. And I think that'd be enough to graph it. Let's put my x and y axes here. Minus 1 and 1. That's x equals minus 1, the axis of symmetry. That's right there. If you remember, I used red line for them, so I'll stay with it. So your function is going to be symmetric along this red line. If you fold the paper along the red line there, your function will be identical. So minus 1 and 1, that's this point. 0 and 0, that's this point. 1 and negative 3 is this point. So when you connect these 3 points, the graph looks like this. Notice, since it's symmetric, this point was 1 unit away from the red line, so it should be 1 here, 1 unit away. This point was 2 away from the red line. There should be 1 here, 2 away on this direction. So on this half, it's going to look like this. So by knowing the axis of symmetry, this is the axis of symmetry, x equals negative 1. This is called the vertex here. And it's minus 1 comma 1. That's the peak value in this case. Let's try one more. There we go. Graph y equals x squared minus 4x minus the 6. Again, axis of symmetry. At x equals negative b over 2a. Negative b is what? Negative 4. 2a, it's 2 times 1. That's 4 over 2, which is 2. So I'm going to make my table here. Pick few values. X, y equals x squared minus 4x minus the 6. I'm going to write this as a point. And again, the first value, I'm going to use the 2 here. Y is going to be 2 squared minus 4 times 2 minus the 6. That's 4 minus 8 minus 6. 4 minus 8 is negative 4, minus 6 is negative 10. That's your vertex. Notice the coefficient of x squared is positive. I know the graph is going to look like this. Let me pick values on one side, like the 3, the 4. When x is 3, y equals what? 3 squared minus 4 times 3 minus 6. 9 minus 12 minus 6. That's a negative 9. 4. Y equals 4 squared minus 4 times 4 minus the 6. 16 minus 16 minus 6, that's a negative 6. Maybe I'll do a 5 here. One more. 5 squared minus 4 times 5 minus 6. 25 minus 20 minus 6. That's a negative 1. Again, the axis of symmetry, this is x equals to 2. X equals to 2 is right here. Your function is going to be symmetrical along this line. So the first value, 2 and negative 10. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Nice to have a graph paper. 3 and negative 9. 4 and negative 6. 5 and minus 1. Connect these points. Looks like this. Now notice this point 1, 2, 3 away from the red line, go 3 away to this direction. This point is 2 away, go 2 away, we'll put you right here. This point is 1 away, I'll put you 1 away. So the other half will look like this. And this is my vertex here. That's actually a minimum value here, and that's 2 comma negative 10. And that's the review for Chapter 9. Good luck on the quiz.